Cool. So thanks. Welcome everyone to the Community Stand-Up second edition for Piral. And this time the big topic is the upcoming 0.11.8. So we didn't publish on weekend. We will publish later today or starting the day tomorrow. And in this call, I also want to bring up the discussion of some of the changes in there. The most notable change will be that we will have a new default bundler. We will now switch by default to Webpack, which shouldn't impact existing projects. But if you scaffold new pilots, etc., you should know that. So either be explicit or just roll with Webpack. It shouldn't be such a big difference, but of course, it's significant still. Nevertheless, before we get there, let's have a look at 0.11.8 in a nutshell and what we did so far. We added one new converter. Thanks to Manuel, we now have CycleJS in there, which is a pretty neat framework, also with a JSX-like syntax, and cannot hurt to have one additional converter, right? We're also able to fix some bugs, for instance, in the Piral CLI Webpack, and another one with the scaffolding, where on Windows, paths to spaces have been, well, not handled very well. So now I think such arguments are handled quite efficiently. And we added a lot more tests, plus we also changed the behavior regarding the optimization of modules, which by default was and that's a parcel thing, to actually go over all the modules in the node modules folder and bring in some optimization that parcel, or to be more specific, Babel can understand these modules better. So there is the, well, let's say, kind of a misconception that unfortunately rolled out into some of also very popular libraries, that if you bring in browser list entry, you essentially tell others what the code should compile to. But actually, it's depending on what kind of package you are creating. If you're creating an application and you're using a bundler, then it actually really means, oh, the browser list entry specifies what's the target, right? So if I include Internet Explorer, then it will be transpiled also for Internet Explorer. So including polyfills, for instance, or the right syntax for JavaScript. But in a library, it means, well, it was already transpiled to this, and there is nothing to do. So if, for instance, for some reason, there's an I11 in there, but it's still the original ECMAScript 6 sources, then Babel will not do anything with it. Babel will just say, oh, I saw you have a browser list entry in your library, and that already says it is already prepared for Internet Explorer, so I will not do anything. Unfortunately, Parcel then really doesn't do anything, and that leads to some modules not really working well with Parcel. And so this was one of the reasons we introduced optimized modules, and it was the default. And with starting with Piral 0.11.8, it will no longer be the default, and you need to opt in. So previously you could opt out of this behavior. And now, since Parcel is no longer the default bundler, we also say, let's also change the behavior, and let's make it not an opt-out, but an opt-in. So by default, your node modules will not be touched, which is good. And if there are really some issues for whatever reason, you can always opt in, and then your modules will be optimized. And that's the long story short. So I think it will be a good change after all, because it was anyway just edge cases, and now these edge cases just opt in, and it's all good. Right. What we also did is we published the initial scaffolding of the VS Code extension. So right now that's not very spectacular. I can open that maybe a second. Let's see if I have it installed here. We just make it a little bit bigger. And we have the Piral logo now in VS Code. Right now, there are no commands shown. We didn't add some, but we already have them in the short list. And we will extend that. We will improve the behavior. So right now it was more about the marketplace entry, and some things should already work. And if you do that at the moment, what we actually will do is that we start a dedicated command prompt for this. All right. Next thing, so what's still out to be done there? One thing is still open. We are still working on the documentation. Let's have a look how it looks so far. So we didn't, let's say, finish it, but already, for instance, the search is a little bit more prominent, and we now settled on 5 distinct top-level menu items. The guidelines, which will include a little bit more, including examples, and will be structured in sections with a getting started section where the first guidelines are in there. The reference section will be completely overhauled. So instead of being that thing that you know from today, which looks like this, it will actually also go directly into a more informative mode, and it will be also completely restructured. The same goes for plugins, which of course is this list, but again, you will have a nice sidebar, and these things at the moment are still to be done there. Tooling types, so all these things will be a little bit more cleaned up. And yeah, we think that overall that should be a great benefit. We don't know yet if all the documentation changes make it in 0.11.8, but it doesn't matter because documentation we can always roll out. So we will certainly keep on working after we publish 0.11.8 and keep on working until the 1.0.0 to get the documentation where we think it should be for the 1.0.0. Right. And also the search, I mean, at the moment, it's still the old search, meaning it's only keyword based and not really contextual. But we will have a full text search, of course, here. And yeah, so the search in general from the results should also be a lot better than it is today. And so I think the search is not only now more prominent up here, but it really will deliver on functionality too, which should be quite good in the end. Right. Okay, so that being said, let's maybe look at some demos, unless there are some questions on this. So either documentation or the 0.11.8, maybe the Webpack by default. Okay. So maybe let's look how the Webpack one works. So as said, we're now using Webpack by default, which means when you npm init, for instance, your Piral instance, and you're not specifying the bundler, so there wasn't specified, then, well, once you hit npm start, we now install Webpack by default. So here nothing was said, but still you see Webpack just builds. And if I run this, then yeah, it's just Webpack that's running. So in the end, I mean, pretty much the same experience. You can just scaffold your instance and run, and it works. Only difference is instead of using Parcel under the hood, it uses Webpack. And so you do that. Oops, I still have the other thing running. Let's see if I can, great. Okay, so, and it's pretty much the same thing. So you don't see any difference, of course. In the end, it's just a different Webpack process running instead of the Parcel process that is under the hood in the Parcel bundler case. But from our experience, it should at this point be pretty much equivalent. The output is even better with Webpack. I mean, since it's just a little bit better maintained. The community is larger, of course, as we know. And yeah, so I guess there shouldn't be much of a change for most existing applications anyway, because yeah, you already settled on your favorite bundler and you should keep it. In order to keep it, let's say for your pilots, either specify when scaffolding the -- bundler option. So that way you can say, oh, that thing I want to scaffold using this bundler, or yeah, set it, install it directly in your dev dependencies. So how that looks, can have a glance at existing code. So when you look in there, you see the Piral CLI, but you see here also Piral CLI Webpack. So if you want to replace that, then either, you know, just call out Piral CLI parcel, for instance, here. Otherwise, if there is nothing specified, then it will just install now Webpack by default. The other option to make the default, let's say, globally available is to use a .piral-rc file. The RC mechanism we will also document a little bit better. I don't think it is documented so much or at all right now, but we will definitely document it for the version 1. So we have also a Piral runtime configuration file, and that you could, for instance, place in your home folder. You could also place it in your working directory, and then these settings will be respected. So a piral-rc file could be something that is quite suitable also for including in your scaffolding, for instance, of the pilots, because that way you ensure that certain things are always configured the same way. Of course, unless someone overrides it for some reason. Okay. Cool. Now let's have a look at something that I wanted to point out in this session. Unless, of course, there's a question. Always, of course, feel free to interrupt. Otherwise, I just keep on talking. So I want to take the chance for demonstrating one cool plugin that we have, which is called piral-configs. So what piral-configs does is it gives you a nice way of allowing configuration of pilots. And the nice way here is based on a JSON schema. So in the end, how it looks is you just, as with any Piral plugin, you just bring it in your extend API section of your instance options. And at that point in time, you would be pretty much done. However, there's still one thing missing, and that you may want to configure, especially for this kind of plugin. And that is the way how to retrieve these configurations. So how that works essentially is that a pilot says, hey, by the way, I want to tell now the app shell how I see, let's say, a custom part of myself, what could be configured. And together with this custom part, there are two things. One is a default configuration. The other one, of course, is how that configuration is validated, because you don't want them to receive just anything. You want to receive only things that you say, oh, this is legal input for me. So there's a good chance or let's say a viable way of overriding the default. Otherwise, just pick the default, because it doesn't make sense what you presented to me. But then, of course, it leaves out the question where now to get an override of this configuration. Why shouldn't we always take the default one? And the retrieval actually is now the way of getting some configuration back. So what we could do, for instance, is we could go to local storage and we could say if there is something stored for the end user, then use it. Now that's, of course, very good for demo purposes. And maybe there's some reason to also use the local storage in your application, because maybe it's really some user settings. but maybe it should be a little bit more, let's say, sophisticated. You can implement all that. So you could, for instance, in your whole application lifecycle initially get some configuration out from your API call, and that could be, let's say, application specific, could be also user specific, whatever, and then you just access that snippet in here. Now again, for demonstration purposes, we only now access the local storage, but you're free to implement your retriever of the actual configuration as you want to. So let's just maybe run this thing. And what we'll do in this application is, I mean, it's still just really a standard scaffolded Piral instance. So the, let's say, layout, etc., is not very interesting. But what's interesting here is that we use this root API. If you don't know this, you always get also a pilot that is already included in your app shell. So that's very good, for instance, for playing around, or for, you know, having something where I say, oh, I don't want to create a pilot later on, but already using the pilot API would make sense. And yeah, so this could be a nice way. I just put it in its own module, in its own function, such that I could really later on, if I want to use this, just copy it, place it in a pilot, and there I go. And in here I now use the APIs coming from this Piral plugin, and one is called define config schema, and the other one is called get current config. So with the config schema, I tell the application shell, oh yeah, I want to tell you about a configuration I can accept. It should be an object. It's not required actually, and it should have one property called logo URL, and that is, by the way, a string. So no further restrictions, but you can use the full set of JSON schema, I think V7, so I guess that's the latest version of the JSON schema specification to describe that. You could even, you know, use in here things like description, etc. So if it could use it with some additional tooling to actually, you know, get these schemas out there and maybe have it in your documentation somewhere. Okay, so that being said, we also have, besides our schema, we have a default value, and the default value now just comes up with the logo URL and sets it to this URL. And if we use that, let's see. Okay, then we get this thing here. So we get the 150, 150. Maybe let's make this also a little bit larger. So sorry, let's add, maybe let's make this 3 by 3. Okay, so that is now fairly all right. But we see we get now this not so spectacular image. And now, how do we want to override this? Well, the user, however that changed it, needs to have something in this local storage. And of course, I don't want to type it in here. So I prepared something. If now the user has, for some reason, an item with the name config root in there, which just is a new entry of local URL, then the user would get this different kind of image in there, right? So already going for this one instead. And now the nice thing is, what if, for instance, there was a, let's say, buggy code and it entered 5 in here? Well, it's still the 150, 150. And you see, we also have a nice error message here appearing. The given configuration does not match the provided schema. And that's why it's now taking the default one, because it violates the schema, right? So there's a number and it was a string expected. So it fully validates this thing, which is quite nice. So there can never be, let's say, something which you don't expect. And you always get something that should work, at least according to your schema specification. And again, I mean, I could go back to this one, or I could, of course, clear the local storage, and then the same thing happens. So there is just nothing, because yeah, that's the expected case, that there is nothing, and then just fix the default. So only when the validation just doesn't work, then at this case we will actually tell in the debugging tools, and the application doesn't crash, of course, but we still make it quite significant that something that didn't go right. Yeah, so that's the Piral config. Again, it was created such a way that it is very flexible. So it has this retrieve function, yeah, that's the way how you may want to interact. Now, of course, how these local storage items are set here, again, it's just for demo purposes. But if you say, oh, that's a cool mechanism, well, that's up to you. So you could, in your application, I mean, for instance, in this code here, you could, of course, have some UI, and then you store it or set the local storage item. I mean, that's now up to the application. But that the get current config call always gets you the right thing, that's wired up via this retrieve. Exactly. So that's one of the show. Any questions or comments on that? All right, because that's everything I've prepared for this time. So now maybe to go into a topic of next steps, and when is the 0.11.8 published? As mentioned already, we want to publish it definitely until tomorrow morning. I guess with a high chance we cannot finish the documentation with all the changes we wanted to do. I mean, that's not a big problem right now. And we will therefore release this step by step. But nevertheless, the 0.11.8, unless there is, of course, something someone tests it out and says, oh, for me that doesn't work at all, can you have a look in there? Will ship, and then, of course, if there's still some issue, I mean, there are a lot of numbers, so we can always ship a hotfix. But so far, I mean, the reason why also we now can swap over to Webpack is certainly because we feel that this is now ready for prime time. We feel that Webpack is actually maybe the better choice. I mean, we still believe in Parcel, but some things have changed since we started the Piral CLI, and one of the things is that Parcel version 1 doesn't get any real maintenance and support anymore. They are all fully committed to Parcel version 2, which is not out there by a long shot, so we don't know when that will be there, and we also don't want to gamble there, of course. So from our perspective, betting now on Webpack opens a lot more doors. Community is larger, and we think that there are some really interesting, let's say, possibilities that open with Webpack, and especially in the area of module sharing, which is one of the things, of course, that are at the heart of Pilot or of Piral, or important for pilots, but certainly not the most important thing. It's one of the things that Piral does for you, I think, also very nicely. But yeah, there are nice possibilities there, and certainly interesting area to join. Yeah, eager to hear your feedback. If there is nothing else, I mean, we still have 3 or 4 minutes left, so happy to answer any kind of questions. I will call it a day, and thank you all for attending. And yeah, just also any feedback, always appreciated. Just write it to us, and yeah, we'll cover it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.